The candles in the great hall of Ashworth Manor burned bright as Edmund Hale gripped Clara Bennett by the wrist and pulled her into the center of the polished floor. The music had not yet started, but every eye in the room had already turned toward them. Clara's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had come to the manor that evening, only to deliver linens to the kitchen staff, dressed in her plain gray servant's dress, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. She had never expected to be dragged in front of 200 guests, dressed in silk and jewels. "Everyone," Edmund announced, his voice carrying across the hall with a mocking smile stretched across his face. "Tonight we have a special performance. This girl, who serves in my father's kitchen, has claimed she knows how to dance better than any lady in this room." Clara's eyes widened. She had said no such thing. She opened her mouth to protest, but Edmund's grip tightened on her wrist, a silent warning. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Some guests raised their glasses, delighted by the unexpected entertainment. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing something cruel beneath Edmund's smile. Clara scanned the room, searching for a friendly face, but found only curious stares and smirks. Even the Duke, Edmund's father, sat near the head of the hall, his expression unreadable, watching his son with a mixture of curiosity and quiet disapproval. "Play the waltz," Edmund commanded the musicians, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "The difficult one, the one only trained dancers can manage." The lead violinist hesitated, glancing at Clara with something like pity, but Edmund's sharp look silenced any objection. The musicians lifted their instruments. Clara's mind raced. She had spent her whole life scrubbing floors and carrying trays, not learning the elegant steps of noble dances. If she failed now, in front of everyone, she would become a joke told in every parlor in the county for years to come. Worse, she feared what humiliation might mean for her position in the household, for her family's survival. She looked at Edmund, searching his face for any trace of mercy. She found none. His jaw was set, his eyes cold and triumphant, as though this moment had been carefully planned for a long time. She did not understand why he hated her so much, but she could see it clearly now, burning behind his practiced smile. "I don't know this dance," Clara said quietly, her voice trembling, but steady enough to be heard by those nearest to her. "Then you will learn quickly," Edmund replied, loud enough for the room to hear, "or you will embarrass yourself in front of everyone who matters in this county." A few guests chuckled, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but beneath that heat, something else began to stir, something she had not expected. A memory. A feeling in her feet and hands that seemed to remember steps she had never consciously learned. The violinist raised his bow. The first note hung in the air like a held breath. Clara closed her eyes for just a moment. She thought of her mother, gone 3 years now, who used to hum songs while sweeping the small cottage they once shared, before misfortune took everything from them. She thought of quiet evenings, when her mother would take her hands and move her gently across the floor, saying softly, "This is a secret between us, Clara. A lady's grace never truly leaves her, no matter what life takes away." She had never understood those words until this very moment. The music began. At first, Clara stood frozen, unsure whether her body would betray her or answer some memory buried deep inside her. The violin's opening notes swirled through the hall, delicate and demanding, the kind of melody reserved for dancers trained since childhood, in the finest ballrooms of the region. Edmund folded his arms, already anticipating her failure, a satisfied smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. But then Clara's foot moved. It was small at first, a single step to the side, perfectly timed with the rising note. Then another step followed, and her arms lifted with a grace that startled even her. The murmurs in the crowd began to shift from mocking whispers to surprised gasps. Lady Beatrice Ashford, seated near the front, leaned forward in her chair, her fan pausing mid-motion. Clara's body seemed to remember what her mind had forgotten. Every turn, every subtle tilt of her head, every graceful extension of her arm, came not from lessons she had taken, but from years of quiet practice she never knew she had absorbed, hidden within her like a seed waiting for the right season to bloom. Edmund's smile faltered. He had expected clumsy stumbling, awkward missteps, perhaps even tears. Instead, he watched Clara move across the floor with a fluid elegance that rivaled the finest performers he had ever seen at court. His confidence, so carefully built around this moment, began to crack. The musicians, sensing the shift in the room, played with renewed energy, the violinist's bow moving faster, more passionately, as though inspired by the unexpected beauty unfolding before him. Clara spun once, her simple gray dress flaring slightly, catching the candlelight in a way that made her look, for just a moment, like she belonged among the finest ladies in the hall. Whispers turned to silence. Silence turned to wonder. Near the back of the room, an elderly gentleman named Lord Nathaniel Gray set down his glass entirely, his eyes fixed on Clara with an expression of genuine astonishment. He had traveled from the capital that very week, hoping for nothing more than polite conversation and perhaps a decent meal. He had not expected to witness something that felt, in that moment, like magic. Clara continued through the demanding sequence of steps, each movement more confident than the last. She could feel eyes on her, dozens of them, but instead of shrinking beneath their weight, she found herself rising to meet them. Something inside her, long buried beneath years of servitude and quiet suffering, began to awaken. Edmund's jaw tightened. This was not how the evening was supposed to unfold. He had orchestrated every detail, from the difficulty of the chosen dance to the public nature of the announcement, all designed to crush the girl who had once, years ago as a child, refused his affection and exposed his dishonesty in front of his own father. He had waited years for a chance to repay that humiliation. Instead, he was watching her transform into something the entire room could not look away from. The Duke, seated at the head of the hall, leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from mild interest to something far more serious. He had known nothing of his son's plan. He had assumed the announcement was simply a light-hearted amusement for the evening, a servant asked to attempt something beyond her station, for a moment of harmless fun. Watching Clara now, he understood this was something else entirely, something his son had orchestrated with far crueler intentions. Clara's steps quickened as the music built toward its climax. She felt the weight of the room's attention, but instead of fear, she felt something closer to freedom. For years, she had been invisible, a servant expected to keep her eyes down and her voice quiet. Tonight, for reasons she barely understood herself, she was finally being seen. As the final movement of the dance approached, the hardest sequence of turns that had claimed the confidence of many trained dancers before her, Clara took a steadying breath. She thought once more of her mother's voice, gentle and encouraging, guiding her through this very sequence years ago, in the quiet privacy of their small cottage. She let that memory carry her forward. She turned once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, her arms extended gracefully, her expression calm and focused despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. The crowd held its breath. Edmund watched, his carefully constructed plan crumbling before his very eyes, his pride beginning to shake in ways he had never anticipated. He had wanted to see Clara humiliated. Instead, he was witnessing her rise, and with her rise came the slow, inevitable fall of everything he had built his reputation upon. The final note of the violin hung in the air, suspended for just a moment before fading into silence. Clara stood perfectly still, breathing heavily, her simple gray dress somehow looking, in that frozen moment, like the finest gown in the entire hall. The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity, the kind of silence that comes just before something enormous happens. Then, from somewhere near the front of the hall, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was Lady Beatrice Ashford, rising slowly from her seat, her eyes bright with something close to tears. Her applause echoed through the stunned silence, joined a moment later by Lord Nathaniel Gray, who stood as well, his own hands coming together in genuine admiration. And then, like a wave finally breaking upon the shore, the entire hall erupted. Guests rose from their seats one after another, their applause growing louder with each passing second, filling the enormous room with a sound Clara had never expected to hear directed at her. She stood in the center of the floor, overwhelmed, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes as she realized what had just happened. Edmund stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his face pale, his carefully constructed plan lying in ruins around him. He had wanted the entire county to remember this night as the evening a servant girl was humiliated before her betters. Instead, he watched in silent horror as they remembered it, as the evening she captivated everyone in the room. His father's eyes found his across the hall, cold and searching. already forming questions that Edmund knew he would not be able to answer easily. The applause continued, rising and falling like waves, as Clara stood at the center of it all, breathless and trembling, unable to fully comprehend how completely her world had just shifted in the span of a single dance. 7 years earlier, in a smaller and far less grand version of Ashworth Manor, a young Edmund Hale sat at the edge of a garden party, thrown by his father for the children of nearby noble families. He was 12 years old then, already accustomed to being praised for everything he did, whether he deserved the praise or not. Servants bowed to him. Tutors softened their criticisms. Even other noble children treated him with a kind of careful respect, unwilling to risk offending the future heir of Ashworth. Clara Bennet, then just 10 years old, had been brought along that day by her mother Margaret, who worked as a seamstress for several noble households in the region, including the Hales. While the noble children played croquet on the lawn, Clara sat quietly near the garden wall, watching, careful not to draw attention to herself. She understood even then that children like her were expected to remain unseen. But Edmund had noticed her. He approached her that afternoon with the confidence of a boy who had never once been told no. "You should be honored I'm speaking to you," he had said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Most servant children never get this chance." Clara, young and unaware of the danger in offending a future lord, had simply shrugged. "I didn't ask you to speak to me." The other noble children nearby had laughed, not unkindly, but enough to make Edmund's ears turn red. He had not expected rejection, certainly not from a servant's daughter. He tried again, this time proposing a game of croquet, insisting that Clara play against him, so he could demonstrate his skill. What Edmund had not accounted for was that Clara, having spent countless hours watching her mother's noble clients play the same game while she waited nearby, had quietly learned every rule and technique simply through observation. She defeated him soundly, 3 rounds in a row, in front of nearly a dozen other children. Edmund's humiliation that day had been quiet but deep. He complained to his father afterward, claiming Clara had cheated, but his father, the Duke, had witnessed enough of the match to know otherwise. Instead of comforting his son, the Duke had said something that stayed with Edmund for years afterward. A true noble does not fear losing to someone skilled, regardless of their birth. He fears only losing his own honor in how he responds to it. Those words had cut deeper into Edmund's pride than any single loss at croquet ever could. From that day forward, he carried a quiet resentment toward Clara, one that had nothing to do with the game itself, and everything to do with the shame he felt in his father's eyes. Meanwhile, Clara's own childhood carried its own hidden sorrows. Her mother Margaret had once been something far grander than a seamstress. Before Clara was born, Margaret had trained as a professional dancer in the capital, performing at some of the most respected theaters in the country. She had given up that life after a fire destroyed the theater where she worked, taking with it not only her livelihood, but several dear friends who never made it out safely. Margaret rarely spoke of those days, carrying the weight of that loss quietly, but in private moments, in the evenings after long days of sewing, she would hum old melodies and move gracefully across their small cottage floor, teaching Clara steps and turns disguised as playful games. "Why do you dance if it makes you sad?" Clara had once asked her mother, noticing the faraway look that sometimes crossed Margaret's face during these quiet lessons. Margaret had smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Clara's forehead. "Because grace, once learned, becomes part of who you are. It waits quietly inside you, ready for the moment you need it most, even if that moment comes long after you've forgotten you ever learned it." Clara had not understood those words fully as a child. She simply enjoyed the quiet evenings with her mother, unaware that these lessons were preparing her for a moment neither of them could have predicted. Margaret passed away when Clara was 15, taken by an illness that spread quickly through their small village one harsh winter. With her mother gone and no other family to rely on, Clara had been forced into service at Ashworth Manor, working long hours in the kitchen and laundry rooms, her days consumed by labor that left little room for memories of dance lessons or quiet melodies. Edmund, now grown into his role as heir to Ashworth, had noticed Clara's presence among the household staff almost immediately after her arrival. The old resentment from childhood had never truly faded, merely settled into something quieter and more calculated. He watched her from a distance for months, waiting for an opportunity to repay the humiliation he still remembered from that garden party years ago. That opportunity finally arrived, when his father announced a grand ball to celebrate an important alliance with a neighboring noble family. Edmund saw in this event the perfect stage for his long-awaited revenge. He spent weeks planning every detail, ensuring the dance chosen would be one of the most technically demanding pieces performed at court, one that had defeated even trained dancers who lacked sufficient skill. He had been certain, absolutely certain, that Clara would fail spectacularly, cementing not only her humiliation, but also, in some quiet corner of his mind, erasing the memory of his own childhood shame by replacing it with a far greater embarrassment for her. What he had not accounted for, what he could never have known, was the quiet legacy Margaret had left within her daughter, a legacy of grace and movement that had been waiting patiently for years to reveal itself. As the applause continued to echo through the hall in the present moment, Edmund stood frozen, the weight of his failed plan crashing down around him. He had built his entire scheme upon the assumption that Clara possessed nothing beyond servitude, unaware that she carried within her something far more powerful than he could have imagined. His father's eyes remained fixed on him from across the hall, cold and questioning, already beginning to piece together the true nature of what his son had attempted that evening. Edmund swallowed hard, feeling for the first time in years a genuine fear of consequences he could not easily escape. The applause showed no signs of slowing. The applause finally began to settle, though the energy in the room remained charged, as if lightning had struck somewhere nearby, and everyone could still feel it in the air. Clara stood at the center of the floor, her chest rising and falling with quick breaths, still trying to understand what had just happened to her. She had walked into this hall expecting humiliation. Instead, she found herself standing beneath the admiring gazes of the very people who had laughed at her only minutes before. Lady Beatrice Ashford approached first, her silk gown rustling softly as she crossed the polished floor. She extended a gloved hand toward Clara, her expression warm, despite the formality expected of someone in her position. "My dear girl," she said, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "I have watched dancers train for years, at the finest academies in the capital, and few of them moved with the grace you just displayed. Where did you learn such skill?" Clara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "My mother taught me, my lady. She danced once, before I was born." Beatrice's eyebrows lifted slightly, intrigued, but she said nothing further on the matter, simply nodding with quiet respect before stepping back to allow others to approach. Lord Nathaniel Grey was next, his expression still carrying traces of the astonishment that had gripped him during Clara's performance. He was an older gentleman, known throughout the region for his sharp wit and his even sharper eye for genuine talent, having sponsored several young artists and musicians over the years. "Young lady," he said, studying Clara carefully, "I have traveled from the capital to attend this gathering, expecting nothing more than tedious conversation about trade agreements. Instead, I find myself witnessing something truly remarkable. Tell me, have you ever considered formal training?" Clara blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I am a servant here, my lord. Formal training was never something available to someone in my position." Nathaniel's expression grew thoughtful, though he said nothing more at that moment, simply exchanging a brief glance with Lady Beatrice that suggested a silent understanding passing between them. Meanwhile, at the edge of the hall, Edmund remained rooted in place, watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of dread. He had expected mockery directed at Clara. Instead, he found himself the subject of curious and increasingly suspicious glances from guests who were beginning to piece together the true intentions behind his earlier announcement. His father, Duke Alistair Hale, finally rose from his seat at the head of the hall and made his way across the room, his expression stern and unreadable. Guests parted respectfully to allow him passage, murmuring quietly among themselves as he approached the center of the floor, where Clara still stood. "Young lady," the Duke said, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that immediately silenced nearby conversations, "that was a performance I will not soon forget. You have honored this household tonight, whether that was the intention behind your presence here or not." Clara curtsied respectfully, unsure how to respond to such unexpected praise from a man whose household she served. "Thank you, Your Grace. I did not intend to perform tonight. I was simply asked to." The Duke's eyes flickered briefly toward his son, cold and searching, before returning to Clara with a softer expression. "I understand. Please, return to your duties for now. but know that this conversation is far from finished." Clara curtsied once more, before quietly making her way toward the edge of the hall, her legs still trembling slightly from the intensity of what she had just experienced. As she passed by the kitchen entrance, she caught sight of Henry, a fellow servant and one of her few genuine friends within the household, standing near the doorway with wide eyes. "Clara," Henry whispered urgently as she approached. "What happened out there?" The entire kitchen staff heard the applause. Mrs. Whitfield nearly dropped an entire tray of pastries trying to see through the doorway. Clara managed a small, exhausted smile. "I don't fully understand it myself, Henry. I simply danced." Henry studied her carefully, noticing the mixture of exhaustion and quiet astonishment still visible in her expression. "Lord Edmund arranged this, didn't he? I heard the servants whispering about his plan, before the ball even began. They said he intended to make an example of you tonight." Clara nodded slowly, the weight of Henry's words settling heavily upon her. "He did. I don't know why he hates me so much, Henry. I have done nothing to deserve his cruelty." Henry's expression grew serious. "Some people carry grudges for reasons that make sense only to them. Lord Edmund has always seemed to resent anyone who does not bow easily beneath his expectations. I've heard the older servants speak of something that happened between you two as children, though none of them ever shared the full details." Clara sighed, glancing back toward the grand hall where the ball continued despite the dramatic interruption. "Whatever the reason, it seems tonight has not gone the way he intended." Back within the hall, Edmund finally found the courage to move from his frozen position near the edge of the room, though every step felt heavier than the last. Guests who had once greeted him with respectful smiles now regarded him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. He approached his father cautiously, aware that a private conversation between them was inevitable. "Father," Edmund began, attempting to maintain some semblance of composure, "I merely intended a moment of harmless entertainment for our guests." The Duke turned to face his son fully, his expression carrying a coldness that Edmund had rarely witnessed, directed at himself. "Harmless entertainment does not require public humiliation as its foundation, Edmund. I saw the intention behind your words before that girl ever took a single step. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." Edmund's jaw tightened, though he said nothing further, sensing that any additional explanation would only deepen his father's disappointment. The Duke studied him for a long moment before finally turning away, making his way back toward the head of the hall to continue his duties as host, leaving Edmund standing alone, with the uncomfortable weight of his failed scheme pressing down upon him. Around the hall, conversations continued to buzz with speculation about what had just occurred. Several guests exchanged theories about Clara's background, wondering aloud how a mere servant girl could possess such refined skill. Others focused their attention on Edmund, whispering questions about his motivations and intentions that evening, questions he had no desire to answer. Lady Beatrice found herself standing near a small group of noblewomen who had witnessed the entire spectacle, their fans moving rapidly as they discussed the evening's unexpected turn of events. "I have never seen Lord Edmund's composure shaken so thoroughly," one of the women remarked quietly. "Whatever plan he had in mind has certainly not unfolded as he intended." Beatrice nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting toward the kitchen entrance where Clara had disappeared moments earlier. "There is more to that young woman than any of us realized. I intend to learn more about her before this evening concludes." As the orchestra resumed playing lighter, more traditional music to accompany the resumption of normal festivities, the underlying tension in the room remained palpable, a quiet current running beneath the surface of polite conversation and genteel laughter. Everyone present understood, whether they spoke of it openly or not, that something significant had shifted within the social fabric of the evening, something that would likely be discussed in parlors and drawing rooms throughout the county for weeks to come. Edmund retreated to a quiet corner of the hall, nursing a glass of wine he had no real desire to drink, his mind racing through the wreckage of his carefully constructed plan. He had wanted, more than anything, to finally silence the quiet shame that had followed him since childhood. Instead, he had inadvertently elevated the very person he sought to diminish, transforming her from an invisible servant into the most talked-about figure of the entire gathering. The night was far from over, and Edmund could sense, with a growing dread settling in his chest, that the consequences of this evening had only just begun to unfold. Later that evening, as the ball continued and guests mingled beneath the glow of countless candles, Duke Alistair Hale retreated to his private study, a quiet room lined with old books and portraits of ancestors long since passed. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, staring at nothing in particular, his mind still turning over the events of the night. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, and the door opened to reveal Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, a stern but fair woman who had managed the household staff for nearly 2 decades. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying respectfully. "I wish to speak with you regarding young Clara, if you have a moment." The Duke gestured toward a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit. I have been meaning to ask about her myself." Mrs. Whitfield settled into the chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Clara Bennett has served this household for nearly 3 years, Your Grace. She arrived shortly after her mother's passing, with nowhere else to turn. I took her in myself, having known Margaret Bennett briefly through her seamstress work for several families in the region." "Tell me about her mother," the Duke said, leaning forward slightly, genuinely curious. "Margaret Bennett was once a dancer, Your Grace, trained in the capital, before tragedy forced her into a quieter life. She rarely spoke of those days, but those who knew her before said she possessed remarkable talent that apparently was passed down to her daughter, though none of us realized the extent of it until tonight." The Duke absorbed this information silently, his expression thoughtful. "And my son? What do you know of his history with this girl?" Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I know only what the older servants have whispered over the years, Your Grace. It seems there was an incident between them as children, something involving wounded pride on Lord Edmund's part. I cannot speak to the full details, as I was not present myself, but the resentment appears to have lingered far longer than anyone might have expected." The Duke sighed heavily, rubbing his temples with one hand. "I had hoped my son had grown beyond such petty grievances. It seems I was mistaken." "If I may speak freely, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield continued, "Clara has always conducted herself with humility and diligence during her time in this household. She has never once complained about her duties, despite the difficult circumstances that brought her here. Whatever occurred between her and Lord Edmund in childhood, she has carried no visible resentment toward him during her service." The Duke nodded slowly, appreciating the housekeeper's candor. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. Please ensure Clara is treated with proper respect moving forward. Whatever my son's intentions were tonight, they do not reflect the values I wish to see upheld within this household." "Of course, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield replied, rising from her chair and curtsying once more, before departing the study, leaving the Duke alone, with his thoughts once again. Meanwhile, back in the Grand Hall, Lord Nathaniel Grey had sought out Lady Beatrice Ashford, the two of them retreating to a quieter corner, near one of the tall windows overlooking the manor's expansive gardens. "I cannot stop thinking about that performance," Nathaniel admitted, swirling the wine in his glass thoughtfully. There was something almost effortless about her movements, as though the dance itself had always belonged to her. Beatrice nodded in agreement. "I have watched countless performances at court, Nathaniel, and few carried the same emotional depth as what we witnessed tonight. It was as though she was dancing not merely for the audience, but for someone else entirely, someone no longer present." Nathaniel's expression grew thoughtful. Perhaps her mother. The girl mentioned learning from her before she passed. "Precisely," Beatrice said. "There was grief woven into every movement, alongside remarkable skill. That combination is rare, even among the most celebrated performers I have encountered." Nathaniel set down his glass, his decision seeming to solidify in that moment. "I intend to speak with the Duke about Clara's future before I depart tomorrow. A talent such as hers should not remain hidden within the walls of a kitchen for the remainder of her days." Beatrice smiled softly, her respect for Nathaniel's character deepening at his words. "I will support whatever arrangement you propose, Nathaniel. It would be a genuine loss to see such talent go unrecognized, simply because of the circumstances of her birth." As their conversation continued, elsewhere in the hall, Edmund found himself approached by a small group of younger noblemen who had witnessed the evening's events with great interest. Among them was Charles Whitmore, a longtime acquaintance of Edmund's who had never been shy about voicing his opinions. "Edmund," Charles said, his tone carrying a hint of amusement that Edmund found particularly irritating in this moment. "I must admit, I did not expect the evening's most memorable moment to come from the kitchen staff." Edmund forced a tight smile, unwilling to let his discomfort show too openly. The girl simply had more skill than I anticipated. It changes nothing. Charles raised an eyebrow skeptically. Does it not? From what I understand, the entire purpose of your announcement was to demonstrate her lack of refinement in comparison to those of us born into noble families. Instead, she demonstrated grace that many trained ladies in this very room would struggle to match. Edmund's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin. I fail to see the point you are trying to make, Charles. Charles shrugged, though his knowing smile suggested he understood exactly what point he was making. Only that pride built upon the assumption of others' inferiority tends to crumble rather spectacularly when that assumption proves false. I wish you luck salvaging your reputation from tonight's events, Edmund. With that, Charles rejoined the other young nobleman, leaving Edmund standing alone once again, his frustration mounting with each passing conversation he overheard throughout the hall. Everywhere he turned, guests seemed to be discussing Clara's remarkable performance, and by extension, his own failed attempt at humiliation. He retreated briefly to the manor's outer terrace, seeking a moment of solitude away from the prying eyes and whispered conversations that had followed him throughout the evening. The cool night air offered some relief, though his mind continued to race through the events that had unfolded, searching desperately for some way to reclaim control over the narrative that had so thoroughly escaped him. As he stood there, staring out over the moonlit gardens, he heard soft footsteps approaching from behind. Turning, he found his younger sister, Charlotte Hale, standing nearby, her expression carrying a mixture of concern and quiet disappointment. "Edmund," she said softly, "what were you thinking tonight?" He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I was thinking of settling an old grievance, Charlotte, one that has bothered me since childhood." Charlotte studied her brother carefully, her expression softening slightly despite her evident disapproval. "Whatever happened between you and Clara, all those years ago, surely it was not worth the cruelty I witnessed tonight. She is a servant in our household, Edmund, someone who has never wronged our family during her time here." "She humiliated me once," Edmund said quietly, his voice carrying more vulnerability than he intended. "In front of father, in front of everyone. I have carried that shame for years." Charlotte's expression grew gentle. "And tonight, in trying to repay that shame, you have created something far greater for yourself. Do you not see the irony in that, brother?" Edmund said nothing, staring silently out over the gardens as the weight of his sister's words settled heavily upon him. The morning after the ball arrived quietly, though the manor itself buzzed with a kind of energy rarely felt during ordinary days. Servants moved through the halls exchanging hushed conversations about the previous night's events, their voices carrying a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Clara rose before dawn, as she did every morning, expecting her usual duties in the kitchen, despite the extraordinary circumstances of the night before. Mrs. Whitfield found her preparing the morning fires, her hands steady, despite the exhaustion still visible in her eyes. "Clara," the housekeeper said, her tone gentler than usual, "the Duke has requested your presence in his study this morning, once you have finished your immediate duties." Clara straightened, her heart skipping slightly at the unexpected summons. "Have I done something wrong, Mrs. Whitfield?" The housekeeper's expression softened into something resembling a smile. "Quite the opposite, I believe. Finish what you are doing, then wash up and present yourself properly. This is not a moment to rush through carelessly." An hour later, Clara stood nervously outside the Duke's study, smoothing the front of her cleanest dress, a simple but presentable garment she reserved for rare occasions. She knocked softly, and the Duke's voice called her inside. The study felt different in the morning light, less imposing than it had seemed the previous evening, when she had briefly curtsied before him in the grand hall. The Duke sat behind his desk, though his expression carried none of the sternness she had expected. "Clara," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." She hesitated only a moment before accepting the invitation, perching carefully on the edge of the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I have spent considerable time reflecting on last night's events," the Duke began, studying her carefully. "I understand from Mrs. Whitfield that your mother, Margaret, was once a trained dancer, before circumstances forced her into a different path." Clara nodded quietly. "Yes, Your Grace. She rarely spoke of those days, but she taught me privately, in the evenings, when I was young. And you carried that training with you all these years, without formal practice or instruction?" "I did not realize how much I had retained, Your Grace, until last night. It surprised me as much as anyone else in that hall. The Duke leaned back in his chair, considering her words carefully. I have received several inquiries this morning, Clara, from guests who witnessed your performance last night. Lord Nathaniel Grey, in particular, has expressed considerable interest in your future. Clara's eyes widened slightly, unsure what to make of this information. What kind of interest, Your Grace? He believes, as do several others who witnessed the ball, that your talent should not remain confined to the duties of a kitchen servant. He has proposed sponsoring formal training for you, an opportunity that would allow you to pursue dance as a legitimate profession, should you desire it. Clara sat in stunned silence for a long moment, struggling to process the magnitude of what was being offered to her. I am uncertain how to respond, Your Grace. I have never imagined such a possibility for myself. The Duke's expression softened further, something almost paternal entering his tone. Take whatever time you need to consider the offer, Clara. I will not pressure you either way, though I will say that opportunities such as this rarely present themselves to someone in your position. It would be a shame to see such talent remain unrecognized, simply due to circumstances beyond your control. Clara nodded slowly, her mind still racing through the implications of everything she had just heard. May I ask, Your Grace, what will happen regarding Lord Edmund? He orchestrated last night's events with intentions I still do not fully understand. The Duke's expression grew serious once more. My son's behavior last night was inexcusable, regardless of whatever grievance he believes justified it. I intend to address this matter with him directly, and I assure you that appropriate consequences will follow. You need not concern yourself further with his intentions toward you. Clara felt a small measure of relief at these words, though a lingering unease remained regarding Edmund's true feelings toward her. She thanked the Duke for his consideration, and excused herself from the study, her mind still spinning with possibilities she had never dared to imagine for herself. As she made her way back toward the kitchen, she encountered Henry near the servants' staircase, his expression eager with curiosity. Well, what did the Duke want? Clara relayed the conversation quietly, watching Henry's expression shift from curiosity to genuine astonishment as she explained Lord Nathaniel's proposal. Clara, this could change everything for you. A chance at formal training, a legitimate profession, away from all of this. I know, Clara replied softly, glancing around at the familiar kitchen corridors she had walked countless times over the past 3 years. But it also means leaving everything I know, everyone I have come to care for during my time here. Henry placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Sometimes the hardest choices lead to the greatest opportunities, Clara. Your mother would have wanted this for you, I believe. She sacrificed her own dreams for your sake. Perhaps now is the time to reclaim what she once lost. Clara considered his words carefully, feeling the weight of decision settling upon her shoulders for the first time in her young life. For years, she had simply existed within the confines of her circumstances, never daring to hope for anything beyond survival. Now, unexpectedly, an entirely new path had opened before her, one that carried both excitement and uncertainty in equal measure. Later that day, as Clara continued her usual duties, word of the previous night's events had spread throughout the surrounding county with remarkable speed. Servants from neighboring estates arrived on various errands, each carrying fresh gossip about the ball and the astonishing performance that had unfolded within Ashworth Manor's grand hall. Clara found herself the subject of curious glances and hushed whispers wherever she went, a stark contrast to the invisibility she had grown accustomed to during her years of service. Meanwhile, within the manor itself, Edmund remained largely confined to his private chambers, avoiding the curious stares and whispered conversations that seemed to follow him wherever he ventured. His father had summoned him for a private conversation that morning, one that had left him shaken and uncertain about his standing within the household and the broader social circles he had once navigated with effortless confidence. The Duke's words had been measured but unmistakably firm. Your actions last night reflected poorly not only upon yourself, Edmund, but upon this entire family. I expect better judgment from you moving forward, particularly regarding how you treat those who serve within this household. Edmund had offered little in the way of defense, understanding on some level that his father's disappointment was justified, even as his wounded pride continued to search for some way to reclaim the narrative that had so thoroughly slipped from his control. As evening approached, Clara found herself standing alone in the small garden behind the servants' quarters, the same quiet space where she often retreated during rare moments of solitude. The events of the past day continued to weigh heavily upon her thoughts. The sudden and unexpected shift in her circumstances, still feeling almost dreamlike in its improbability. She gazed up at the darkening sky, thinking once more of her mother's gentle guidance during those quiet evening lessons so many years ago. Grace, once learned, becomes part of who you are, Margaret had told her. Clara finally understood the full weight of those words, recognizing that her mother's sacrifice and quiet resilience had prepared her, without either of them fully realizing it, for a moment that would forever alter the course of her life. 3 days after the ball, a carriage bearing the crest of Lord Nathaniel Grey arrived at the front gates of Ashworth Manor, its arrival drawing curious glances from staff and family members alike. Clara had been informed earlier that morning that Lord Nathaniel wished to speak with her personally before finalizing any arrangements regarding her potential training, and she had spent the hours since in a state of nervous anticipation. She was called to the manor's smaller drawing room, a more intimate space, typically reserved for private conversations rather than grand social gatherings. Lord Nathaniel sat comfortably in a high-backed chair near the window, a cup of tea resting on the small table beside him. Lady Beatrice Ashford, who had extended her stay at the manor specifically to be present for this conversation, sat nearby as well. "Clara," Nathaniel said warmly as she entered, gesturing for her to take the seat across from him. "Thank you for joining us. I hope you have had time to consider the proposal discussed with the Duke." Clara settled carefully into the offered chair, her hands folded in her lap. "I have thought of little else these past few days, my lord." "And what conclusions have you reached?" Beatrice asked gently, her tone encouraging rather than pressuring. Clara took a steadying breath before responding. "I am deeply grateful for your interest and generosity, both of you. I never imagined such an opportunity could exist for someone in my position. However, I must admit to feeling uncertain about what this path would truly mean for my future." Nathaniel nodded understandingly. "Uncertainty is natural, given the magnitude of what is being offered. Allow me to explain more fully what this opportunity entails, so that you may make an informed decision, rather than one based on assumption or fear." He proceeded to describe, in careful detail, the nature of formal dance training available at several respected academies within the capital, institutions that trained performers for prestigious theaters and noble courts throughout the region. He explained that his sponsorship would cover the costs of tuition, housing, and living expenses during her training period, with no expectation of repayment beyond her dedication to developing her natural talent. "I do not offer this out of mere charity, Clara," Nathaniel added, his expression sincere. "I have spent decades supporting emerging artists and performers, and rarely have I witnessed raw talent as remarkable as what you displayed that evening. This is an investment in genuine potential, not simply an act of kindness." Beatrice leaned forward slightly, adding her own perspective to the conversation. "I understand the fear of leaving behind everything familiar, Clara, but consider this an opportunity to honor your mother's legacy, to reclaim a path that circumstances once denied her. You carry her gift within you, whether you fully recognize it yet or not." Clara considered their words carefully, feeling the weight of the decision pressing upon her more heavily than ever before. "What would happen to my position here at Ashworth Manor, should I choose to pursue this training?" "That decision remains entirely yours to make," Nathaniel replied. "Though I suspect, given the Duke's evident goodwill toward your situation, that your position here would remain secure should you ever wish to return, though I doubt such a return would be necessary once your training is complete." Clara nodded slowly, absorbing the full scope of what was being offered. After a long moment of contemplation, she finally spoke, her voice steady, despite the nervousness still fluttering within her chest. "I accept your generous offer, my lord. I believe my mother would have wanted this for me, even if she never had the chance to see it herself." Nathaniel's expression brightened considerably at her response. "Excellent. I shall make the necessary arrangements immediately. You should prepare to depart for the capital within the fortnight, allowing sufficient time to settle matters here before beginning your formal training." As Clara rose to leave the drawing room, her mind still spinning with the enormity of the decision she had just made, she nearly collided with Edmund, who stood just outside the doorway, apparently having overheard at least part of the conversation. His expression carried a complicated mixture of emotions, none of which Clara could easily interpret. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice lacking the arrogant confidence that had characterized his previous interactions with her. "I understand you will be leaving Ashworth Manor soon." Clara studied him carefully, uncertain how to respond given their complicated history. "I will, my lord. Lord Nathaniel has offered to sponsor formal training for me in the capital." Edmund nodded slowly, his gaze dropping momentarily to the floor before returning to meet hers. "I owe you an apology, Clara. What I attempted at the ball was cruel, born from grievances I should have released long ago. I see now how thoroughly my actions have backfired, though I recognize that consequence does not excuse the intention behind them." Clara regarded him with cautious surprise, unsure whether to trust the sincerity behind his words. "Why did you hate me so much, Edmund? I never understood what I had done to deserve such treatment." Edmund sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of genuine discomfort. "You did nothing wrong, Clara. The fault lies entirely with my own wounded pride, carried since childhood, over a moment of embarrassment that meant far more to me than it ever should have. I have spent years nursing that resentment, allowing it to fester into something far uglier than the original incident ever warranted." Clara considered his words carefully, feeling a complicated mixture of lingering hurt and cautious understanding. "I forgive you, Edmund, though I cannot pretend the events of the ball did not cause me considerable distress." "I understand," Edmund replied quietly. "I do not expect forgiveness to erase what I attempted, nor do I expect our history to be forgotten so easily. I simply wish to acknowledge my wrongdoing before you depart, whatever that acknowledgement may be worth to you now." Clara nodded once, a small gesture of acceptance rather than complete reconciliation, before continuing on her way, leaving Edmund standing alone in the corridor with his thoughts. The conversation, brief as it was, marked a subtle shift in the dynamic between them, though neither could fully predict how their paths might cross again in the future. Within the household, news of Clara's impending departure spread quickly among the staff, generating a mixture of excitement and quiet sadness among those who had come to know her during her years of service. Mrs. Whitfield, in particular, felt a personal sense of pride in the young woman's unexpected transformation, from an anonymous servant to a figure of genuine intrigue and opportunity. "I always suspected there was more to you than mere kitchen work, Clara," the housekeeper remarked one evening, watching as Clara carefully packed her few belongings into a modest traveling case. "Your mother would be immensely proud, were she able to witness this moment." Clara smiled softly, though tears gathered briefly at the corners of her eyes. "I only wish she could have seen it herself, Mrs. Whitfield. This opportunity feels as much hers as it does mine." "Perhaps in some way, she does see it," the housekeeper offered gently. "Grace and talent such as yours rarely emerge from nothing, Clara. Wherever she is now, I imagine she takes great comfort in knowing her sacrifice was not made in vain." Clara nodded, comforted by these words, as she continued preparing for the journey that awaited her. A journey that would carry her far beyond the familiar walls of Ashworth Manor, and into a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. The journey to the capital took nearly 3 days by carriage, winding through countryside that grew increasingly unfamiliar to Clara with each passing mile. She had never traveled beyond the borders of the county surrounding Ashworth Manor, and the sight of towering buildings and bustling streets that greeted her upon arrival left her feeling both exhilarated and overwhelmed in equal measure. Lord Nathaniel had arranged for her accommodation at a respectable boarding house near the prestigious Camden Academy of Dance, an institution renowned throughout the region for producing some of the finest performers to grace the country's most celebrated theaters. Clara arrived at the academy's entrance on her first morning, her nerves fluttering with a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she gazed up at the impressive stone building before her. The academy's director, a sharp-eyed woman named Madame Eleanor Fairfax, greeted Clara with a measured expression that revealed little of her true opinion regarding this unusual new student, sponsored not through traditional means, but through the direct intervention of a respected nobleman, based solely on a single remarkable performance. "Lord Nathaniel speaks highly of your talent," Madame Fairfax said, studying Clara with an appraising gaze that made her feel as though every flaw and imperfection was being carefully catalogued. "However, I must be candid with you. Talent alone does not guarantee success within these walls. Discipline, dedication, and formal technique matter equally, if not more so." Clara nodded respectfully, understanding the weight behind the director's words. "I am prepared to work as hard as necessary, Madam Fairfax. This opportunity means everything to me. Her first weeks at the academy proved far more challenging than she had anticipated. While her natural grace and instinctive understanding of movement had astonished the guests at Ashworth Manor, she quickly discovered that formal training demanded a level of precision and technical mastery that went far beyond anything she had learned from her mother's informal lessons. Her fellow students, many of whom had trained since early childhood under the guidance of professional instructors, possessed a foundation of technical knowledge that Clara had to work tirelessly to catch up to. "Your extension needs work," one instructor remarked during an early lesson, adjusting Clara's arm with brisk efficiency. "Natural talent will only carry you so far without proper form." Clara absorbed each correction with quiet determination, practicing long after her formal lessons concluded, often remaining in the academy's practice rooms well into the evening hours, until her muscles ached with exhaustion. She thought frequently of her mother during these difficult weeks, drawing strength from the memory of those quiet evening lessons in their small cottage, reminding herself that Margaret had once possessed the same dedication and passion that now fueled her own efforts. Among her fellow students, Clara found an unexpected friend in a young woman named Charlotte Winters, whose family, though not nobility, held enough wealth to afford formal training for their daughter from an early age. Charlotte possessed none of the snobbery Clara had feared might characterize her fellow students, instead offering genuine friendship and encouragement during the difficult early weeks of adjustment. "You have something the rest of us had to work years to develop," Charlotte told her one evening as they rested together after a particularly grueling lesson. "There is an emotional quality to your movement that cannot be taught through technique alone. Madam Fairfax may not admit it openly, but I have seen her watching you during lessons with far more interest than she typically shows new students." Clara smiled gratefully at her friend's words, though doubt continued to linger within her during these early months of training. She often wondered whether she truly belonged among these accomplished young women, many of whom had spent their entire lives preparing for careers that Clara had stumbled into through a single unexpected evening. Word occasionally reached her from Ashworth Manor, through brief letters sent by Henry and Mrs. Whitfield, updating her on happenings within the household she had left behind. She learned that Edmund had grown noticeably quieter since her departure, his usual confidence replaced by a subdued demeanor that puzzled many within the household who had known him only as an assured and sometimes arrogant young heir. Mrs. Whitfield's letters, in particular, carried news of the broader social consequences that continued to ripple outward from that fateful evening at the ball. "The story of your performance has spread throughout the county and beyond, Clara," one letter read. "Several noble families have inquired about your training, and Lord Edmund's reputation has suffered considerably, as details of his intentions that evening have become more widely known among polite society." Clara felt a complicated mixture of emotions upon reading such updates, unable to fully separate lingering resentment toward Edmund from a genuine, if reluctant, sympathy for the consequences he now faced. She had not sought his downfall, merely survival in a moment designed for her humiliation, yet the broader repercussions of that evening continued to unfold regardless of her own feelings on the matter. As months passed, Clara's technical skill gradually caught up with her natural talent, her dedication and discipline earning increasing recognition from instructors who had initially viewed her unconventional entry into the academy with skepticism. Madam Fairfax, in particular, began to take a more direct interest in Clara's development, offering additional private instruction that few students received during their first year of formal training. "You possess something rare, Miss Bennet," Madam Fairfax remarked during one such private session, watching Clara complete a particularly demanding sequence with growing confidence. "Most performers spend years developing technical proficiency before discovering how to infuse genuine emotion into their movements. You arrived already possessing that emotional depth, and now you are finally acquiring the technical foundation to fully express it." Clara flushed with pride at these words, understanding the significance of such rare praise from a woman known throughout the capital for her exacting standards. "Thank you, Madam Fairfax. I only hope to honor the opportunity given to me." "You are honoring it well," the director replied firmly. "I believe, within another year of dedicated training, you may be ready for consideration in some of the capital's most prestigious performances. That is no small achievement for someone who arrived here with no formal background whatsoever." As Clara's first year of training drew toward its conclusion, she found herself reflecting frequently on how dramatically her life had transformed since that fateful evening at Ashworth Manor. The humiliation Edmund had intended for her had instead become the catalyst for a future she had never dared imagine, one that honored her mother's memory while forging an entirely new path forward for herself. Yet even as her confidence and skill continued to grow, a small part of her remained curious about how the events unfolding back at Ashworth Manor might eventually intersect with her own journey once again, sensing somehow that her story with Edmund Hale and the broader Ashworth household was far from finished. Back at Ashworth Manor, the months following Clara's departure had proven increasingly difficult for Edmund, as the consequences of that fateful evening continued to unfold in ways he had never anticipated. What had begun as whispered gossip among the guests present at the ball had gradually transformed into a broader narrative, circulating throughout the region's noble circles, one that painted him in an increasingly unflattering light. The first significant blow came several weeks after the ball, when Edmund received word that a proposed marriage arrangement between himself and Lady Genevieve Ashcombe, daughter of a respected neighboring noble family, had been quietly withdrawn. The Ashcombe family cited vague concerns about compatibility, but Edmund understood, with growing dread, that the true reason likely stemmed from the story of his cruelty toward Clara that had spread throughout the county. His father called him into the study once again, following this development, his expression carrying a weariness that seemed to have deepened considerably since the night of the ball. The Ashcombe family was not the only one to express reservations, Edmund, the Duke said gravely. I have received similar indications from at least 2 other families who had previously expressed interest in a potential match for you. Edmund sat in stunned silence, the full weight of his social standing's collapse finally becoming clear to him. I did not realize the consequences would extend this far, Father. Actions carry weight beyond their immediate moment, Edmund, the Duke replied firmly. You attempted to publicly humiliate an innocent young woman based on grievances from your own childhood, grievances that reflected far more poorly on your character than they ever did on hers. Society has taken notice, and I cannot shield you from the natural consequences of your own choices. Edmund left the study that day carrying a heavier burden than he had anticipated, understanding for the first time the true scope of what his misguided attempt at revenge had cost him. In the weeks that followed, he found himself increasingly isolated from the social circles he had once navigated with effortless confidence, invitations to gatherings and events growing noticeably sparse compared to previous seasons. Desperate to salvage some measure of his reputation, Edmund attempted to organize a smaller gathering of his own at Ashworth Manor, hoping to demonstrate through careful hosting and gracious behavior that the incident at the ball had been an isolated lapse in judgment rather than a genuine reflection of his character. He invited a select group of acquaintances, hoping to slowly rebuild the goodwill he had so thoroughly damaged. The gathering, however, did not proceed as he had hoped. During dinner, one of his guests, a young nobleman named Frederick Ainsworth, raised the topic of Clara's departure with pointed curiosity that Edmund suspected was intentionally provocative. I understand the young woman from your household has found considerable success at the Camden Academy, Frederick remarked casually, watching Edmund's reaction carefully. Lord Nathaniel Gray speaks quite highly of her progress whenever her name arises in conversation. Edmund forced a tight smile, unwilling to let his discomfort show too openly in front of his guests. I am pleased to hear she has found success elsewhere. Elsewhere being the key word, I suppose, Frederick continued, a hint of amusement coloring his tone. Given the circumstances of her departure from this household, I imagine there is some irony in her success being directly tied to the very evening you intended for her humiliation. The other guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the tension building beneath the surface of the conversation, though none dared interject directly. Edmund's jaw tightened as he struggled to maintain his composure. I have acknowledged my error regarding that evening, Frederick. I fail to see the benefit in continuing to revisit it. Frederick raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, though his expression suggested he had achieved exactly the reaction he had intended to provoke. Of course, my apologies. I merely found the situation curious, given how thoroughly it has become the subject of conversation throughout the region. The remainder of the dinner proceeded with strained politeness, though Edmund could sense the underlying awkwardness that continued to permeate the gathering. His attempt to reclaim his social standing, through careful hosting, had instead served only to further highlight the very incident he had hoped to move beyond. The story of Clara's transformation, continuing to overshadow whatever positive impression he had hoped to cultivate. Following this failed gathering, Edmund retreated increasingly into solitude, spending long hours alone in his private chambers, or wandering the manor's expansive grounds, wrestling with the full weight of consequences he had never anticipated when he first conceived his plan for revenge. His sister Charlotte, observing his growing isolation with concern, sought him out one afternoon, as he sat alone near the manor's garden pond. "You cannot continue punishing yourself indefinitely, Edmund," Charlotte said gently, settling onto the bench beside him. "What is done cannot be undone, but you can choose how you move forward from this point." Edmund sighed heavily, staring out over the still water of the pond. "I do not know how to move forward, Charlotte. Everywhere I turn, I am reminded of my own failure, my own cruelty. I built my entire sense of self around a status and reputation that has now crumbled entirely because of my own poor judgment." Charlotte studied her brother carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps that crumbling is not entirely a tragedy, Edmund. Perhaps it offers an opportunity to build something more genuine in its place, something not so dependent on the good opinion of others or the suppression of old grievances." Edmund considered his sister's words carefully, though he offered no immediate response, the weight of his own reflections still too heavy to allow for easy resolution. Charlotte remained beside him quietly for several minutes longer, before eventually rising and returning to the manor, leaving her brother alone once again with his thoughts. As the months continued to pass, Edmund gradually began to withdraw from many of the social pursuits that had once consumed his time and attention, instead focusing increasingly on matters directly related to the management of the estate itself, a responsibility his father had begun delegating to him with greater frequency. Whether this shift represented genuine personal growth or simply a retreat from social embarrassment remained unclear, even to Edmund himself, though the change in his daily routine did not go unnoticed by those closest to him within the household. Meanwhile, news of Clara's continued success at the Camden Academy occasionally reached Ashworth Manor through various channels, each report serving as a quiet reminder of the dramatic reversal of fortune that had unfolded since that fateful evening. Edmund found himself, despite his lingering discomfort with the topic, unable to fully suppress a grudging admiration for how thoroughly Clara had transformed her circumstances, rising from the humiliation he had intended to inflict into a genuine testament of talent and resilience that continued to grow with each passing month. Nearly a year and a half after Clara's arrival at the Camden Academy, Madame Fairfax summoned her to a private meeting, her expression carrying an unusual excitement that immediately caught Clara's attention. "Miss Bennet," the director began, gesturing for Clara to take a seat, "I have received an invitation of considerable significance, one I believe you are ready to accept." Clara sat attentively, curiosity building within her as Madame Fairfax continued. "The Royal Theatre has requested a selection of the Academy's most promising students to perform during their upcoming autumn showcase, an event attended by nobility and dignitaries from throughout the region. I intend to include you among the performers, should you feel prepared for such an opportunity." Clara's heart raced at the announcement, a mixture of excitement and nervousness washing over her simultaneously. "I would be honored, Madame Fairfax, though I am uncertain whether my skill has developed sufficiently for such a prestigious stage." Madame Fairfax's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "I would not offer this opportunity if I doubted your readiness, Miss Bennet. You have worked tirelessly these past months, and your progress has exceeded even my initial expectations. This showcase represents a natural culmination of that dedication." Over the following weeks, Clara threw herself into preparation with even greater intensity than usual, working alongside Charlotte Winters and her other fellow students to perfect a demanding routine that would showcase the full range of skills she had developed during her time at the Academy. The pressure of performing before such a distinguished audience weighed heavily upon her. Yet beneath that pressure lay a quiet confidence that had grown steadily since her arrival, nurtured by months of discipline and dedicated practice. News of the upcoming showcase eventually reached Ashworth Manor as well, carried through the correspondence Clara continued to maintain with Mrs. Whitfield and Henry. The Duke, upon learning of the event, expressed genuine interest in attending, curious to witness firsthand the culmination of Clara's remarkable journey since that fateful evening at his own household's ball. "I believe this would be a valuable experience for the entire family," the Duke announced one evening at dinner, addressing both Edmund and Charlotte. I intend to attend the Royal Theatre's autumn showcase, and I would appreciate your company as well." Charlotte agreed eagerly, genuinely curious to witness Clara's progress after so many months apart. Edmund, however, hesitated, uncertain whether he possessed the emotional fortitude to witness Clara's success so directly, particularly given the complicated history that continued to color his feelings toward her. "Father, I am uncertain whether my presence would be appropriate, given the circumstances of Clara's departure from this household," Edmund said carefully, choosing his words with deliberate caution. The Duke regarded his son with a steady, appraising gaze. "I believe your presence is precisely what is appropriate, Edmund. You bear responsibility for setting certain events into motion, and witnessing their genuine conclusion may offer you a measure of understanding that has thus far eluded you." Edmund reluctantly agreed, understanding that his father's words carried an implicit expectation he could not easily refuse. As the date of the showcase approached, he found himself experiencing a complicated mixture of anticipation and dread, uncertain how he would react upon seeing Clara again after so many months of separation and reflection. The evening of the showcase arrived with considerable fanfare. The Royal Theatre filled to capacity with members of the region's most prominent families, all eager to witness the emerging talents the Camden Academy had cultivated throughout the year. Duke Alistair Hale, accompanied by Charlotte and a visibly tense Edmund, secured seats near the front of the Grand Theatre. The ornate architecture and glittering chandeliers creating an atmosphere of genuine grandeur, befitting such a significant cultural event. As the performances began, each student showcased skills refined through months of dedicated training, the audience responding with polite appreciation to each demonstration of technical mastery. Edmund watched with growing anticipation, unable to fully suppress his curiosity about how Clara's performance might compare to her fellow students, wondering whether the raw talent he had witnessed at Ashworth Manor had truly developed into something worthy of such a prestigious stage. When Clara finally emerged onto the stage, dressed in an elegant costume that bore no resemblance to the simple gray servant's dress Edmund remembered from that fateful evening, a hush fell over the audience, an anticipatory silence that seemed to sense something remarkable was about to unfold. The orchestra began playing a composition considerably more complex than the piece Edmund had selected for her humiliation so many months ago. Yet Clara moved through the opening sequence with a confidence and precision that immediately captivated the entire theater. Edmund watched, transfixed, as Clara's performance unfolded before him, each movement carrying the same emotional depth he remembered from that first unexpected display of talent, now enhanced by a technical refinement that spoke to the countless hours of dedicated practice she had invested since her departure from Ashworth Manor. The audience's initial polite attention gradually transformed into rapt fascination, murmurs of admiration rippling through the theater as Clara moved through increasingly demanding sequences with apparent effortlessness. As her performance reached its conclusion, Clara executed a final, breathtaking sequence of turns that drew audible gasps from the audience, her movements carrying both technical precision and genuine emotional resonance that few performers, regardless of their experience, ever managed to achieve so completely. When the final note faded into silence, the theater erupted into thunderous applause, guests rising from their seats in genuine admiration for what they had just witnessed. Edmund found himself standing among the crowd, applauding with a sincerity he had not anticipated feeling. The wounded pride and lingering resentment that had once defined his relationship with Clara, finally giving way to genuine, unreserved admiration for what she had accomplished. Beside him, Duke Alistair Hale wore an expression of quiet satisfaction, understanding fully the significance of witnessing this moment alongside his son. "Do you understand now, Edmund?" the Duke said quietly, leaning toward his son as the applause continued around them. "What you nearly destroyed with your misguided attempt at revenge, and what has instead flourished despite it." Edmund nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on Clara as she offered a graceful bow to the enthusiastic audience, tears of genuine joy visible even from their considerable distance. "I understand, Father, more thoroughly than I ever have before." Following the conclusion of the showcase, guests gathered in the theater's grand foyer to offer their congratulations to the evening's performers, the atmosphere buzzing with genuine excitement over the remarkable talent that had been displayed throughout the night. Clara stood near the edge of the gathering, still catching her breath from the emotional intensity of her performance. when she noticed Duke Alistair Hale approaching, accompanied by Charlotte and, somewhat to her surprise, Edmund. "Clara," the Duke said warmly, extending his hand toward her in a gesture of genuine respect. "Your performance tonight was truly extraordinary. I am honored to have witnessed it." Clara curtsied respectfully, though her expression carried genuine warmth, rather than the formal distance that had once characterized her interactions with the Ashworth family. "Thank you, Your Grace. Your support, and Lord Nathaniel's generosity, made this moment possible." Charlotte stepped forward eagerly, embracing Clara with genuine affection. "You were magnificent, Clara. I always suspected there was something remarkable within you, even during your time serving in our household." Clara smiled warmly at Charlotte's kind words, before her gaze shifted, somewhat cautiously, toward Edmund, who stood slightly apart from the others, his expression carrying none of the arrogance or resentment she remembered from their previous encounters. Instead, his eyes reflected something closer to genuine humility and quiet respect. "Clara," Edmund said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised her, "I wanted to properly congratulate you tonight. What you accomplished on that stage was nothing short of remarkable, and I recognize now, more fully than ever, how thoroughly I misjudged you all those months ago." Clara studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the calculated cruelty that had once defined his treatment of her. She found none. "Thank you, Edmund. I appreciate your words, and I am glad you were here to witness this. I have thought often about that evening at the ball," Edmund continued, choosing his words carefully, "and about the childhood grievance that drove me to such cruelty. I understand now that my resentment was never truly about you, Clara, but about my own inability to accept a moment of vulnerability without allowing it to fester into something far uglier than it ever needed to be." Clara nodded slowly, appreciating the genuine self-reflection evident in his words. "We were both children then, Edmund, carrying burdens neither of us fully understood. I hold no lingering resentment toward you, though I confess, the events of that evening changed the course of my life in ways I could never have anticipated." "For the better, it would seem," Edmund replied, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his previously somber expression. "Your mother would be immensely proud of what you have accomplished, Clara. I only regret that my actions, however unintentionally, played any role in revealing what she had given you." Clara felt a surge of emotion at the mention of her mother. Her eyes glistening slightly with tears, she quickly blinked away. "She always told me that grace, once learned, remains part of who you are, waiting quietly until the moment you need it most. I understand those words far more completely now than I ever did as a child." As their conversation continued, Lord Nathaniel Grey approached the small gathering, his expression beaming, with evident pride, at Clara's remarkable performance. "Clara," he said warmly, "the theater's director has already inquired about securing you for a more permanent position within their upcoming season. This is merely the beginning of what promises to be a truly remarkable career." Clara's eyes widened with genuine astonishment at this unexpected news, the magnitude of her transformation over the past year and a half finally settling fully into her understanding. From a servant girl forced into humiliation on a ballroom floor, to a performer now sought after by one of the region's most prestigious theaters, her journey had unfolded in ways she could never have imagined when she first arrived at Ashworth Manor, following her mother's passing. The Duke, observing this exchange with quiet satisfaction, placed a gentle hand on Edmund's shoulder. "This is what genuine talent and resilience can accomplish, Edmund, when given the opportunity to flourish, rather than being suppressed through cruelty or misguided pride. I hope you carry this lesson with you throughout the remainder of your life." Edmund nodded solemnly, his gaze still fixed on Clara, as she continued her conversation with Lord Nathaniel, the genuine joy radiating from her expression, a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty he remembered from that fateful evening at the ball. Whatever remained of his old pride and resentment had finally, completely dissolved, replaced by a quiet respect for the strength and grace Clara had demonstrated throughout her remarkable journey. As the evening drew to its conclusion, guests slowly began departing the Grand Theater, their conversations still buzzing with excitement over the exceptional talent they had witnessed that night. Clara stood near the theater's entrance, gazing up at the star-filled sky above the Capitol, reflecting quietly on how dramatically her life had transformed since that terrifying moment when Edmund had first pulled her onto the ballroom floor with cruel intentions. She thought of her mother, Gone now for several years, but present within every graceful movement Clara had performed that evening, her legacy finally honored in a way neither of them could have predicted during those quiet lessons in their small cottage so long ago. She thought of Henry and Mrs. Whitfield, still awaiting her occasional letters from Ashworth Manor, proud of the journey she had undertaken. She thought of Lady Beatrice and Lord Nathaniel, whose generosity and belief in her talent had opened doors she never knew existed for someone of her circumstances. And she thought, finally, of Edmund, the boy whose wounded pride had once sought to destroy her, inadvertently becoming the catalyst for her greatest triumph instead. Whatever bitterness had once existed between them had finally, fully dissolved, replaced by a quiet understanding that both had grown considerably from the painful lessons that fateful evening had taught them. As she prepared to return to the Camden Academy to continue her training, now with the promise of a genuine career unfolding before her, Clara allowed herself a rare moment of pure, unguarded happiness, understanding fully at last that the humiliation once intended to break her had instead become the very moment that set her free.